It's incredibly exciting to be able to stand here and share with you the story that the Lord has given me in bringing me here. I've been incredibly blessed for the last year to serve as area director for CMDA here in Houston, serving the largest medical center in the world. For those of you who are from out of town, more than 21 hospitals, over 100,000 employees, 50,000 students and trainees, and more than 10 million patients annually. It's a ministry that we're incredibly proud of and excited for. And I'd love to share more at our booth, but today I'd like to share the story of how the Lord brought me here and why I'm here. To give you just a little bit of background, I am a homeschooled military brat who has never called one place home for more than a few years. This is me and my dad on his retirement from the Air Force after a long career moving us from Nebraska to Colorado, Florida, South Korea, Washington, D.C., St. Louis, and then finally retiring there. My entire life up to that point, I had been an exceptional student and high achiever. I finished every single book in Awana, read Lord of the Rings when I was 10 years old, knew the answer to every question in every Sunday school class, had everything put together, entirely not with my parents' plan, but we had all been homeschooled, and I had graduated high school right before I turned 16 and started college full-time that summer. Excellent grades, always thought I knew what I was doing, and had just an amazing blessing in parents who always pushed us to achieve all that we could achieve and be the absolute best that we could be. I had the opportunity after graduating high school to preach and teach at our local church, grew immensely in my faith through some incredible mentors who really blessed and poured into me, and thought I knew what I was doing with my life. After a couple of years at community college and transferring away to a 4-year school, I was looking at what I wanted to do next with my life and was blessed to find an internship and a full-time position at Sigma Aldrich there in St. Louis before realizing that if I wanted to stay in this growing field of molecular biology and genetics that I had found so fascinating, I should probably go ahead and go back to school and get my PhD. And up to this point, it seemed like everything in my life was going really smoothly and I had everything under control. I had graduated with a 4.0 right before I turned 20, and was coming from an amazing research company in Sigma Aldrich to an incredible research institution. But this was the first of many avenues in my life where I was either the Lord had a very different plan for me than I had for myself. See, my family was there in St. Louis, but my college girlfriend had just gotten a job in Texas. And so I applied in St. Louis and in Texas, didn't get in St. Louis, did in Texas, and we broke up before I ever moved. And I thought, Lord, that's a little low. So I moved to Dallas, not knowing a single person, having no connection, not really being a fan of the weather or the local sports teams, and yet here I was. So I was incredibly blessed to be at an amazing research institution. UT Southwestern does a phenomenal amount of research, has some amazing folks that have come out of it. They make a big point of showing everyone on the tour that there are 6 Nobel laureates who have done their work at Southwestern. They are big deals, and they like to tell everybody. Now, I'm coming in very much as a fish out of water. While I was fascinated with science and loved molecular genetics, both of my parents had engineering backgrounds and had no way to prepare me for what was to come. Neither of them had any idea what a career in research would look like, and I had been only by the grace of God able to make it this far because I thought, well, you get a degree and then you go get a job. That's just how the world works, and had no idea what this process would look like. So very quickly, I went from being an incredibly high achiever and feeling like I was on top of the world and could handle anything that was thrown at me, to being surrounded by a bunch of other students who had all been at the top of their classes, who were coming in with published papers, with recommendations from phenomenal research labs, with fully fleshed out plans for what they wanted to do. And I'm struggling to figure out what's a journal, what's a postdoc, what does it look like to do any of this, because I've never done any of it before. So I'm already coming in feeling a little stressed out, feeling a little behind, not quite knowing what I'm doing. And then I managed to land in about the most stereotypical lab that one could land in. I had a research mentor who would be excited his wife was out of town because he didn't have to go home, and expected the same from anyone who worked with him. So as you might imagine, this was not the best introduction into a life of laboratory science. And then, as if all this wasn't enough, as if I'm not feeling like I'm behind and a little bit out of my depth, we have this incredibly exciting thing in your second year of graduate school called the qualifying exam, where you lay out your entire research plan, everything you hope to do over the next few years, all the research, all the experiments, and you're told, all right, we're going to question you until you have to say, I don't know. And if you fail, you leave the program. So just a little bit of stress on an already stressful situation. And while I'm preparing for this, I'm looking around at all these other students who are more accomplished than I was, came in more prepared than I was, had better ideas than I did, and I'm starting to wonder if I belong. And at the same time, continuing to hear from my mentor, we've got to work harder, we've got to do more, you've got to push a little more. I met with him every Friday morning and remember one Thursday evening being in the lab until 4 a.m., rushing home to get a couple hours of sleep to rush back in and hear him say, it's not enough, we've got to push more. All the while looking at this, getting further and further behind because the guy who's supposed to be helping me at this process doesn't ever return my emails. So by the time I get started, I'm a month behind from already feeling like I'm way over my head. And so as I'm looking at all of these students doing a lot better than me, as I'm realizing that while I've gotten connected with a local church, while I've found some friends, I don't really have a strong community, I'm getting more and more worried and more fearful about what happens if I don't make it. Up until this point, I have succeeded at everything I've put my hand to. I've passed all my classes, I have a great GPA, I still have the medal sitting on my mantle somewhere. And yet all of a sudden, I'm faced with the possibility of failure and of a life of success being thrown away. And so while I've connected with some friends, I've gotten plugged into our CMDA chapter there in Dallas, I go from being a regular member and attender to saying, I'm sorry, I just don't have time. I've got to work more. I've got to try a little harder. I've got to keep working on this plan. I can't fail this, I'm so sorry. And that isolation turned darker and darker as I kept thinking, what happens if I fail? What happens if I'm not enough? I hadn't even really wanted to be in Texas, and now I can't imagine not finishing this degree. And as if all of this wasn't enough, in the midst of this whole process, my mentor announces that he's been recruited away and will be leaving the university. And if I'm going to continue on, I have to start over. And the last couple of years will be thrown away. So in the midst of this, I'm asking God, what in the world am I supposed to be doing here? Even if I pass, I'm behind, and I have no idea how I'm going to make it through. And all I can think about is how my parents have always pushed me to succeed, to be the best that I can be, and how am I going to look them in the face if I come away from this a failure? And so as I have no contact with those who love the Lord and who could have pointed me in the right direction, who could have reminded me that I was here for something more than just a couple of extra letters, I get more and more afraid and start to think that I can't face the people that I love if I walk away a failure. And so what had just been isolation and worry and fear becomes thoughts and then eventually plans of suicide and how I might take my own life instead of look at those that I've let down. And by the grace of God, the director there for our Dallas chapter is the most ruthlessly compassionate man I've ever met. And I am getting messages week in and week out. We love you, we miss you, hope we see you again on Monday. How are things going? We're praying for you. And I keep blowing him off and keep blowing him off until 1 week to get him to leave me alone. I say, all right, I'll come. And the speaker who comes in that week is a pastor from one of our local churches who shares about the root of fear and anxiety. And out of all the weeks that I've blown off and all the weeks I haven't made it, this is the one where my heart was finally softened to show up. And what he goes on to share with us is that the root of your fear and anxiety is an identity that is placed anywhere other than Jesus Christ. That to settle ourselves in accomplishment, in achievement, in purpose, in even mission, even what we might feel is a noble calling, can at any moment be taken away from us. And I had to be content in knowing that if he had brought me here, he had a purpose for it. So at this time, I'm invested in our student leadership group. I've been a part of that group for a while. And as I hear this message, at first, I'm overjoyed because I'm reminded that my identity is set in something beyond just this accomplishment and this achievement. But that joy very quickly turns to shame because, again, I've had it all put together my whole life. How can I now turn around and tell all these people that I've been serving with, leading with, teaching, mentoring in some cases, and say, I was this close to losing my life. I had gotten so fearful and lost track of my purpose to such an extent that I was in despair. But through the grace of God, I was reminded of a sermon that I had heard preached, Mark chapter 9. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this passage, but a father has brought his son who's been undergoing seizures, has been demon-possessed, and he asks if Jesus can do anything for him. He says, if you can do anything, have compassion and help us. Jesus said, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. And the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. And that simple mantra became my prayer for the next several months. Lord, I believe that you have something more in store for me than just achievement and accomplishment. I believe that my life is more than what I thought I came here to achieve, but I'm struggling to see that. Will you help me? And that started with just a simple conversation with one friend from my church that I could finally say, this is how far I've fallen and how afraid I am. Will you pray with me? To getting to share with some of the other students who were here on our leadership team. And as I was putting this together and getting to go back and look through, I was so blessed that Stan used to be a wedding photographer and is always taking pictures. And so I have a picture of the retreat where I finally got to open up and share with those who were in leadership how far I had fallen and how deeply I had struggled with this identity. And every time I would share, whether with one or two or a handful, it was a victory just to have not been afraid and being able to tell them, this is where I've been and how deeply afraid I've been. Will you support me? Will you be here with me? And so day by day, I felt a little more confident and a little more sure until finally Stan asked me, would you be willing to share this in front of our Monday lunch group? All the med students, everybody that's normally a part of our fellowship, a lot of whom you've never met and a lot of whom look up to you. And I thought, Lord, this will be a victory just to say it, and I don't know if it's going to mean anything, but I'll go. And I still remember not being able to meet people's eyes when I first shared, not knowing what they were going to think of me because, well, these other people already knew me and loved me and they were kind of stuck with me. So, but what about these students? They don't owe me anything. And as soon as I finished sharing that story, one of the students came to me and said, this is where I am. I'm so afraid. Can you talk to me? And over the next couple of months, I got to share how the Lord had brought me out of darkness, how he had shown me a purpose greater than a few more letters and another achievement. And by the time I graduated, I got to see that same student was now a student counselor, reaching out to others and building them up, and got to see that one of the darkest and scariest moments of my life had already been used as a testimony for God's glory. And so, thank you. So fast forward about a year, I'm having a conversation with a friend of mine, a dear friend who doesn't know the Lord, and we're talking about what we think we're supposed to do next. And I had already kind of felt that maybe the science world wasn't for me. I had landed in a great lab and had a great mentor and enjoyed what I did again, was able to enjoy the science, but really felt, I think I'm supposed to go help people. I've gotten so much more out of being in student government, out of being able to share with these students. I think this is where I'm supposed to be. And he shared a similar sentiment and said, you know, that's great. I would love to be able to help people and really use my story to help them get where they need to go. It's too bad there's not really any job that fits that description. You kind of just have to fall into it. And the Lord kind of reached down and knocked on my heart and said, he's describing a minister. You know what this is. And so I told my, at the time, fiance and now my wife, I think that the Lord is leading me into ministry. I think this is where I could see myself being for the long term. And we started to pray after a lunch in a little barbecue spot across from campus, Lord, open the doors. And so we thought, surely this will be 20 years, many years down the road. I'll do something science-y. Maybe I'll go into academic affairs, leverage the student government work, and I'm going to just have a long career working with people, and I'll have learned everything I need to learn, and I'll be ready whenever that call comes. And instead, our lovely CMDA director called me up and said, you know, they're looking for someone to fill that role in Houston. Would you think about it? We said, that's the biggest med center in the world. I've only ever done this. I don't have any formal training or experience. anything that would qualify me for it, but we prayed that the door would open, and so we'll pray and see if the door opens. And so my wife and I started to pray that if this was real and if this is where we were meant to be, that he would make it clear to us. We went through 4 rounds of interviewing, each step going, this doesn't make any sense, Lord, but if you open the door, we'll go. And in the midst of that interview process, the thesis committee had signed off on me graduating that summer. Everything was set. And then we couldn't replicate half of our data. And they said, hey, you're going to have to redo most of this, right after I had accepted that position and told them I could start that summer. So we called my boss and the president of our council and said, look, I think this is where the Lord has called me, but there's no way I can start this summer. Give me as long as you can, stretch this out as much as you're able, and one way or another, I will be there. I think this is where the Lord has called me, and if I need to walk away, I will, but give me as much time as you can to try and finish this out. So they extended me until January 3rd. So my wife graduated from her residency program, came down and started her practice, and for 6 months, I commuted back and forth from Dallas to Houston to see her on the weekends and then live in the lab, trying desperately to get something pulled together over those last 6 months. I defended my thesis December 16th and got down here and started that job 2 weeks later. It's been an amazing journey to see that out of what started out as me being, I joke to this day, being dragged to Texas kicking and screaming, not knowing a soul in Texas and not really wanting to be here, and instead I found a purpose and a calling so much greater than my achievement and accomplishment. And I've been able to see that instead of looking at my life with fear and the what if I don't succeed and what if I don't make it, that instead, even if the Lord changes my path drastically, will I be okay to follow him wherever he might lead? Whether there's a door closed that I thought should have been open, or whether he takes my career a hard left after all of this work and all the time that I've put in, am I at peace with wherever he's going to lead me? And we're so excited to see where he's going to go next. Thank you.